Hello and welcome to District Reports. I'm Eve Galanter, a former alder on the Madison Common Council, and your host for today's program focused on the very first ever City of Madison tax levy referendum question that will appear on your November 5th election ballot. It's important to note that this referendum question appears on the back of your ballot, and it's one of 4 referenda. 2 are from the school district, the Madison School District, and 1 from the state legislature. Before we begin, there's some information about the process that I hope will be helpful to our viewers and those who are hearing about this through their alder or through other means. First, earlier this month, on October 8th, the mayor released 2 2025 budget proposals. One version is based on the ballot referendum being approved by the voters, and the other version in case the referendum is not approved. These 2 budgets will go first to the Common Council Finance Committee, with any amendments from alders to either or both budgets due by October 23rd. A final Finance Committee vote is scheduled for October 28th. Those are the options that will be available depending on whether the referendum is approved or not approved. Both budgets as amended will then be sent to the Common Council, but no final action can be taken until the November 5th election results determine which budget they'll be voting on. Any amendments by alders to that budget will be due by November 7th. The council is scheduled for debate on those amendments in the at their Common Council meeting, and a final vote on November 12th. It could be the 13th or the 14th if additional meeting time is needed. That gives you the outline of the timeline so that if you wish to contact your alder, this will give you adequate notice. Joining me today for discussion of the city's proposal to exceed the levy limits set by state law and increase property taxes for 2025 and subsequent years to pay for funding city services and operations, or failing that, to enact cuts to many of those agencies and services and impose a new infrastructure special charge that would appear on our municipal services bill. Joining me is Dave Schmiedicke, the finance director for the city of Madison. Dave, thank you for joining me today.
Eve, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the underlying question. How did the city get to this projected $22 million deficit that's causing us to go to referendum?
Yeah, that's a question we've been answering for a long time, not just this year, but ever since 2011, really, when the state legislature put into place very strict limits on increases in property taxes and really reduced aid to local governments, particularly cities like Madison. The city has faced a gap between the cost to maintain the services each year that residents expect and the amount of revenue we're able to raise to pay for those services. Now, we've done a series of steps over the past decade and a half to balance the budget. So things like employees paying more for their health insurance, across the board reductions to city agencies, revenues that we're able to increase, that the state allows us to increase, like a vehicle registration fee or special charges. So we've done a number of steps, and then the pandemic came. We saw dramatic drops in revenues. Room taxes, for example, fell by 70%.
But didn't some money come from the federal government
just
to
gonna-
offset some of those losses?
Yeah, and that helped. That got us through the years of the pandemic. That aid ends this year. And so, and because of those limits on our revenues from the state legislature, we don't see the recovery in revenue that the state saw, for example, with increases in income and sales tax collections and the largest surplus they'd ever had, $7 billion. We don't have that in the city. And so that coupled with rapid increases in inflation over the last couple of years, now thankfully it's coming down, but all that together kind of brings us to this point for the 2025 budget with that $22 million gap between what it costs to maintain the services residents expect and the revenues we're able to raise.
And just to respond to one of your points, which is that those sales taxes and room taxes that are available, those all do go to the state before a percentage determined by the state comes back to each of the cities.
Sales and income taxes. Room taxes stay at the local level, but yeah, the sales and income taxes are collected by the state. And under a program called shared revenue, are shared with cities, towns, villages, and counties. And Madison has really been shortchanged under what the state legislature has done. We get the lowest amount per resident of any city in the state, despite being the state's economic engine and the fastest growing city in the state. So it's a dramatic
unfortunately,
impact.
neither of us is in the state legislature, and we can't answer to why. But one why I'd like to ask is, why are we not using what we've been told is the city's fairly substantial reserves, the so-called rainy day funds, to offset the deficit? How much is there currently in this rainy day fund?
Yeah, we have a rainy day fund. We also call it our general fund unassigned balance. And the amount that's there is about $82 million. And that's about 21% of the budget. Our minimum target is about 15% of the budget. And we have that there. That's just good budgeting practice, that we have those reserves in the case of some sort of economic emergency, a pandemic, and things like that, so we can keep services going for a certain amount of time. That balance is built up really because of the high inflation over the last couple of years and large interest earnings, basically on what is kind of like a savings account. But it's one-time money, and we will use it. The executive budget and what the council will consider includes a 5-year plan. And over that 5 years, that surplus, whatever you want to call it, in the rainy day fund will be spent down, but still at a level that we need to have good financial practices, as well as it's a big part of our AAA bond rating, which keeps interest costs low.
Right.
So
But
there
how
are plans
much-
to use it.
Okay, how much are we planning to use, for example, this year in each of the options that would be available?
Right. So we think over the 5 years we can use about $25 million. Under the, if the referendum is adopted, we would not use it in 2025, but we would use it in years after that as a part of this 5-year plan. If the referendum is not adopted, we would use about $6 million of it to help balance the budget in 2025.
And why that level? Why not more? To reduce the impact on the local taxpayers.
Well, it's one-time money. So if we use it in 1 year and it's gone, then we don't have anything in the next year and we're just back in this again. And so we have to think about using it over multiple years so that we can, we're not over-reliant on it in terms of maintaining ongoing service levels that residents expect.
Now, when we talked about what's causing us to go to referendum, We mentioned the state legislature. What other options are available but not being offered to us for raising revenue? And, why don't we have them?
Well, that's a great question. I think cities in Wisconsin are unique in terms of being heavily reliant on property taxes and state aid to basically fund services. In Madison, we're heavily reliant on property taxes. We get very little state aid, as I mentioned earlier. Around 3/4 of the city budget is funded from the property tax. When you look at cities in other states, they have a broader array of options. They might have a sales tax, for example. Cities in some states have local income taxes. Their transit and transportation activities, for example, might be a part of a regional authority that has sales or fuel taxes and things like that.
How was it determined that they were eligible for these options, and we were not?
Well, this would be other states. So those state legislatures decided the way that they were going to finance local government services was to give that authority to the folks who make those decisions, who live in those communities. And that's not the case in Wisconsin.
Milwaukee.
Milwaukee is a recent case, and Milwaukee was really facing dire financial circumstances. They have their own pension system, and they were facing hundreds of millions of dollars of deficits and would have to look at cutting police and fire and library services, for example, by over 25%. And so the legislature, I think, saw that they couldn't have the state's largest city face that type of situation. So they authorized a 2% sales tax for the city of Milwaukee. But that's the only city in the state that has that option. There have been proposals to provide sales tax authority to cities in Wisconsin, but the state legislature has chosen not to implement that.
Okay. And have we, in fact, advocated for such an option?
The city's advocated for things for many years, as I'm sure you can remember back in your involvement in city government, whether it's more shared revenue, more sharing of those income and sales taxes that are generated by residents and businesses in Madison, as well as things like sales tax authority. And the state legislature has chosen not to approve those and has actually taken actions to be sure that Madison doesn't get a reasonable share of those revenues.
And the rationale for that?
I will leave that to those that are in the state legislature to explain. I mean, I think some of it is, I think, how the legislature views Madison to some extent. And I think that probably was the case when there weren't these strict limits on property taxes. But with these limits on property taxes, the city has no place to go, and we're not having those other options to tap into, to help fund the fastest growing city in the state, the people who are moving here, and the services that they're looking for.
I've noticed, as surely most people have, the dramatic growth in the building of apartments along East Washington and everywhere throughout the city. Mm-hmm. As those properties increase in value, are those additional revenues not sufficient to help us fill some of these gaps?
That's a question we get a lot. It's like, well, values are going up, my home value is going up. There's really very little connection between that increase in value and how much we can increase the levy. There's a formula in this cap that the legislature has created that does try to capture some of this new construction value, but there's no connection to population growth or inflation. And so that's where we really fall behind.
Some of our neighboring communities are also experiencing these problems. Fitchburg, Monona will also be having referenda.
Right.
You mentioned some options, sales taxes, regional transportation authorities. If we were to have one of those options in the future, would property tax increases such as we're facing be eliminated or reduced?
Hard to say. I would say reduced probably. I mentioned earlier that, we still are heavily reliant on property taxes. And so as costs go up, those revenues need to go up. If we did have other options, yeah, it would probably help with that pace of increase in property taxes. Probably could be slowed down.
A topic for another program,
yes,
perhaps.
Indeed.
We know what will happen if the referendum is not approved. We've seen the alternative submitted to the council by the mayor. All departments were asked to propose cuts in services and staff to get to a 5% reduction in their existing budget. Headlines alerted us the Goodman Pool would be affected, as would ice rinks and libraries and brush collection, yard waste, all the things that are top of mind for so many people in our community. Will all services be affected equally if the referendum is not passed?
So was proposed in the executive budget is a reduction of about 5.6 million in funding for city services. It is not proportional to different sort of parts of the budget. So about half of the budget is for public safety. So our police department, our fire department. Another action that the state legislature took recently.
Right, we cannot reduce that beyond.
Well, we're very limited in what
Right.
we can do there. It's called a maintenance of effort requirement. Right. And so while it's half of the budget, it's only about 16% of the cuts that are being proposed because of that state legislative limitation or mandate. And so there are other parts of the budget that are taking proportionally larger cuts. There's a $1 million cut to Metro, for example, Metro Transit. So that might result in less bus service on evenings and weekends. There would be, the libraries would have to, library branches wouldn't have Sunday hours, just the central library would.
Right, well, only 2 of the branch libraries currently have Sunday hours.
Those 2 branches would not have Sunday hours.
Because most of the rest do not currently have
That's
Sunday
correct.
hours. Yeah,
Right.
Other, the Goodman Pool, the pool is not going away, but we would be perhaps leasing it or giving management to a different company and city employees would not be involved?
So the Goodman Pool is not a part of what's being proposed in the budget for cuts. It was proposed in terms of the 5%.
Okay.
But the pool's not affected. Ice rinks would be closed under what's in the budget to be proposed for reductions. Yard waste drop-off sites, the hours would be curtailed dramatically. There would be fewer rounds of brush pickup from people's homes. So many impacts across services that the city provides.
You mentioned transit. We've received a fair amount of federal funding for our transit. Was that all focused on the establishment of the BRT rather than ongoing funding for transit generally across the city?
Yeah, so most of the federal money that the city receives for transit is for capital costs. So in the case of Bus Rapid Transit, it's buying those electric buses that you see now, building the stations, the various roadway and signal changes that need to be put into place. So most of that's capital costs. The federal government does provide some operating support, as does the state, but most of it's, borne by whether it's fares or the city's general fund subsidy or partner communities who get services do also contribute. Most of that's coming from property taxes as well.
Right.
In those
and that
communities.
has been expanding in recent years, contracts with neighboring
Yes.
communities.
Yep.
You mentioned operating. Is our capital budget being affected by this referendum as well?
So this is just for the operating budget.
Okay.
We don't see the same limits that the state legislature puts on the operating budget on the capital side. So we have more flexibility in the city to fund capital projects. Where it might affect it going forward is our ability, we might build something and we have to staff it. Right? And so that's where it could affect the capital budget. In terms of when we're talking about investments and services that residents expect, it's not just people, most of it's people, but it's also the equipment and the buildings and so on that that help to deliver those services, whether it's a library or a fire station or things like that.
There was no proposal to shut down any or close any of the fire stations. Is that correct?
Well, not included in the budget that's before the council. In the 5% proposals, the fire department, while not looking at closing a fire station, was looking at reducing, maybe a ladder company or something like that, because in order to get to 5%, and with most of those most of the funding in the police or fire department being staff, there's really very few options other than that.
Okay. We have coming up, as I've noted, all these meetings at which council members are going to be making these difficult decisions. Have you had opportunities to meet with all of them as well as during the course of this? I'm sure you've answered these questions many times before. What is the sort of number one question that council members bring to you that reflect their concerns on behalf of their constituents?
I think it's the questions you've been asking. It's like, how did we get here? And what are our options for moving forward? And how can we do it in ways that limit as much as possible the impact on services to residents, on city staff? The council in April adopted a resolution that kind of expressed their values in the face of addressing this deficit, as well as sort of specific things they wanted to see. So some of that includes, trying to avoid layoffs of staff, maintaining current service levels. That's where they expressed saying, yes, put together a referendum resolution, look at efficiencies, look at other of our very limited revenue options, and then look at this as a long-range issue that we have to work on over time. So I think the council's been really trying to engage on this and be thoughtful about, well, what do we have to do now? How do we do it in a way that has the least impact on our residents and city staff who deliver services to residents, and then how do we address this in the long term? So, and we got to that point through a lot of questions and briefings and discussions.
Right. Just going back for a moment to the options that we've hoped to receive and have eluded us. If over the course of the next several years, the will of the legislature changes with regard to providing these options to a city like Madison, how will that affect what you've got laid out for this over this 5-year period? Would we actually then see a change and a reduction in some of the increases that have come about as a result of not having options?
I think to first answer your question, I think the change that we're talking about happening, whether it's, let's say, a sales tax or something like that at the local level, occurring in the next 5 years is probably pretty remote. And it definitely will, it would be very difficult for it to happen, I would expect, within the next 2-3 years.
Which is a shame, because so much of that would be paid by the multiple thousands of visitors we get in this wonderful city every year.
Right. Visitors to the city would be kind of helping to bear that cost and of the services that they also get a benefit from. But if somehow we do get to that point of, let's just say, a half-cent sales tax, that would go a long way to, as you mentioned earlier, perhaps reducing the rate of growth in property taxes. Allow the city to keep pace with the population growth that's occurring and maintaining those service levels that all residents in the city expect.
Well, there is a great deal that we could add to, but we have some limited time here. I think both Dave and I hope that this information is helpful to our residents as they prepare to vote. So thank you, Dave.
Welcome.
If you have questions or comments to share with your alder or all alders as they make these critical decisions about city services and the referenda, either call the council office at 608-266-4071 or go to cityofmadison.com/council and share your message online. It appears that this will be the final episode of District Reports. I've been privileged to interview alders and city staff on issues facing the city of Madison for more than a decade. I thank them, the Madison City Channel, and you, our viewers. I'm so very grateful to have had this opportunity for continuing my commitment to public service. Thank you. And please vote. Good evening and welcome to District Reports. I'm your host, Eve Galanter.